Hello everyone. Good morning or good afternoon for the rest of you that are joining from Europe and Asia. I'd like to start by thanking all of you for joining us today, as well as the panelists that will be sharing their pretty valuable insights throughout this session. For a brief introduction about this session, all of the attendees and the people that have registered will be receiving the recordings as well as the slides that will be presented within this webinar. All of your questions are welcome. Please send them through the questions and the chat boxes of the GoToWebinar tool. So the way how this event will be happening is by doing a brief presentations regarding this event's topics, which will be certainly about the Canadian energy storage market. I myself will be starting with a presentation of a general overview of the market, followed by representatives that will be showing the valuable information, representatives from BLG, Border L'Énergie, and the Energy Storage Canada Association. And finally, one valuable speaker as well from the IESO, the Independent Electricity System Operator, which operates the Ontario electricity market. So first things first, I will start with the presentation from the Clean Horizons side. I myself am Naim El Shami. I'm a senior analyst at Clean Horizon. I am in charge of Northern American markets, and I will have the pleasure to present some of Clean Horizons overviews regarding the Canadian market. So just to keep it short, Clean Horizon is an energy storage consultancy that has been here since 2009. We have led more than 400 engagements in 81 countries all over the world and have designed more than 11 gigawatt hours of energy storage systems internationally. Our services span over the market analysis part, where we do regulatory and revenue stream assessment for energy storage systems, once again on the international level, but we can also lead technical consulting services where we help project developers, investors, and large utilities in their energy storage procurement exercises, from contract drafting up to the commissioning phases, as well as contractor selection. On that note, I will not be taking much more time and go straight to the presentation of today's subject, starting with the current status of the energy storage market. So as of today, and based on the Clean Horizons database of public energy storage projects, the Canadian market has an approximate volume of 2 gigawatts, 7 gigawatt hours of energy storage systems. So I should note that the values that you will be seeing in the slides are solely based on projects that can be publicly verified with a specific location of taker and the project developer, as well as having a sizing of 500 kilowatts and above. So what we're showing is certainly a conservative view of the market, but it's still a pretty great overview of the leading parts and the hottest parts when it comes to energy storage. So if we're looking at this map, one of the largest markets today when it comes to energy storage is Ontario, with approximately 2 gigawatts, which makes up most of the capacity that is installed today in the market, thanks to recent changes and recent procurements that have allowed for this evolution of the market, followed by Alberta, which is as well one of the most dynamic markets as of today, and other more punctual projects that have emerged throughout the years in other states like Quebec, Saskatchewan, or Yukon. So once again, you should bear in mind that this data gives you a baseline of the projects, but still shows you which ones are the most dynamic as of today. Now, if you try to go deeper in the two most let's say, hottest markets as of today in Canada, which are Alberta and Ontario. Maybe starting with the Alberta one. So the main thing to know today about Alberta is that this market is still living in a regulatory framework overhaul in order to allow for a simpler and more transparent access to energy storage systems. So as of today, in order to participate in the market, energy storage system still has to bid as a generator or as a load in the electricity or in the energy or ancillary service markets. Moreover, in order to do that, the system must have a sizing of 7.5 megawatts at least in order to participate in all of the frequency controlled services ancillary markets in order to capture the totality of the accessible revenues. And finally, given that all of these difficulties have already been identified by the Alberta electricity system operator, some new changes have started to be involved and to be created since 2021 as part of the energy storage engagement process from the ESO in order to solve some of these main issues. The first one being the resolution of the double charging issue. Double charging meaning that batteries had to pay grid chargers both for the charging and discharging processes. The second one about the full range participation. As of today, in order to participate in the energy market, only the discharge capacity of the battery was taken into account in the market. So in the future iterations, this load part where the battery can be considered as a load in order to charge will also be valued as an accessible revenue stream. And finally, the state of charge management of every energy storage asset will also be the responsibility of the market participant and not a mandatory part in the initial market submission, which would also allow for easier transparency and easier management of the asset whenever it comes to trading strategy over these markets. Now, given that I was talking about these new evolutions of this market and how it started to open up to energy storage, one of the first tangible and concrete efforts in Alberta was the creation of the fast frequency response service and the fact that it was opened to energy storage systems. So this process was launched back in 2021 in order to procure between 20 and 40 megawatts of fast frequency response from 1 to 3 different providers. So all of these providers within their bids had to present systems with a capacity of at least 5 megawatts and a maximum of 25 megawatts per project, and with a minimum ability to provide no less than 1 megawatt of frequency control ability for one continuous hour. The other challenge was to be in service by March 15th of 2022 and respect some of the technical requirements of the service, which are quite similar to the load shed service for imports, also called LSSI. Some of these conditions are the first one being the need to detect and respond within 0.2 seconds, 200 milliseconds to respond and react to frequency shifts as part of the FFR service as soon as the system frequency reaches 59.5 hertz, which is 0.5 hertz below the nominal frequency level of 60 hertz in Canada. The way how this reaction would be happening would be through the injection of power, the power injection from the battery in order to counter this drift and allow for the grid frequency to get back to the 60 hertz level. And some additional technical elements included in the component and the system itself, such as an under frequency protective relay, plus event recording through a SCADA system in order to better assess how the battery has reacted in these frequency drifts and that would allow for a better assessment of the role of energy storage systems in general when it comes to controlling the frequency of the power system. One of the other interesting aspects of this new opportunity was that any project that was selected under this program still had the right to participate in the other markets within the Alberta system, being the energy one and other ancillary services. The only condition was that the megawatts that were retained under the FFR services could not be used in parallel for other services. So that was the only condition, and thanks to that, 2 projects were already selected. So if I go to this next slide, showing you the March 2022 iteration, 2 projects were retained for a total of 30 megawatts. 110 megawatt was developed by Canadian hydro developers, and another 20 megawatt project was developed by Infinite LP. Both of these projects were operational in time in March 2022, and this experiment lasted 1 year during last March, where the service term was concluded and the observation period was over, in order to assess how these batteries played a major role when it comes to frequency control. So the final report was published by the AESO in last June, and on the 26th of June. Some of the main conclusions of this report were that BESS have actually demonstrated their potential to provide real value to the Alberta electricity system and the Albertans in mitigating the impacts of any frequency drift. Frequency drift mostly due to supply losses, forecasting issues when it comes to renewable assets, or also incidents affecting interties between states. This experiment also provided valuable insights into the opportunities and challenges that service providers have also faced up whenever they were dealing with the batteries and the interface between accessible markets and the FFR service, which is also another valuable experiment, given that the market should be evolving and opening up to energy storage assets. And finally, this experiment allowed for the discovery of a new challenge when it comes to batteries that were connected to the distribution grid, especially when it comes to injecting power onto the distribution grid, and some limitations that could be observed, especially ones related to tramping rates and power injection levels. So that was it for Alberta. If you try to shift to the Ontario one, which is one of the most interesting ones as of today, when it comes to market participation for an energy storage system is possible under 2 different iterations. The first one, which is called the self-scheduling approach, is the way when an energy storage system is commanded by the market player, by the project operator, and by doing that, the energy storage system can get access to most of the revenues. These revenues being the energy market, regulation service, work support, and direct support. So sorry, I misspoke. So that's the case for non-dispatchable. Given that it's non-dispatchable, the system operator, the IESO, would have direct control of this asset and commanded throughout the regulation service in order to maintain operational margins during the entire period of day. The other approach is the dispatchable systems where the control is maintained by the project operator, by the project developer, let's say, under which it cannot get access to the regulation service, but still offers the ability to participate in other ancillary service markets like the operating reserve and the voltage support ones, plus the energy market, where they can do arbitrage, and finally to local capacity auctions that have been done on a rolling basis over the past few years. So all of that has been said, and that has been happening over the past few years. and it was one first, let's say, milestone allowing for merchant energy storage projects, which was eventually supported by another complementary one thanks to long-term procurements. So these long-term procurements would be discussed with Mr. Nick Topfer in a few from the IESO, who will be giving us his own insights and the IESO's insights relating to this process. So in a few words, these long-term procurements will be mostly eyeing a target of 2,500 megawatts of energy storage systems by 2027. The first round of these long-term procurements was concluded in last June with 930 megawatts, and with an upcoming few volumes in the next procurements that should allow for this 2,500 megawatt target by 2027. Just to not take up much more time, I will conclude with another interesting aspect in Ontario, which was one of the earliest opportunities for energy storage systems, and more notably behind the meter ones. It was the global adjustment mechanism. This global adjustment mechanism, it created an opportunity for nearly 150 megawatts, 340 megawatt hours of energy storage systems that were used by in a behind the meter application in order to shave demand peaks and allow for electricity bill reductions for many clients. The way how that was done is actually represented in a business model that I will be showing over here. So we took a subset of hypotheses based on the operational date and the cost of the system while considering a 10-year project, sorry, a 20-year project. This project would also be, we consider that it could be benefiting from the actual investment tax credit in order to optimize its cost. So we consider a 30% rate with a storage, with a 1 megawatt project having a duration between 1 and 4 hours. So we will not be dealing with the front of the meter projects in this presentation. We will be just focusing on the behind the meter ones with the global adjustment charge. So based on that, if we consider this 1 megawatt project being installed by a client of the Class A consumers having a peak demand above 1 megawatt and less than 5 megawatts, we could see that this 20-year project would be generating a net present value of 2 million euros per megawatt, with a really interesting IRR of up to 85%, which is actually one of the justifications why this mechanism had pretty solid success over the past few years. And if we try to push it even further and try to see the NPV with the numbers of peaks that are actually shaved and how the ITC would be impacting that. So that's represented in these two graphs. So the first graph without the ITC, we can see that without the ITC, the project can become profitable with a positive NPV starting from two peaks that are shaved throughout the year. The year starting on the year before, I will give you the dates. Sorry, go back, starting between the year before and ending on the 30th of June of the next one. So you have a 12-month period between July of the year before and 30th of June of the current year. Having said that, so without the ITC, without a 30% ITC rate, the project becomes profitable starting from two peaks that are shaved. Whereas if we use the ITC, that starts from one peak and beyond, which shows one of the main interests coming from investment tax credits and their positive impact on projects. So having said that, I will stop here and give the stand to my other colleagues from BLG.
Okay, so I think people can see me at least, and I'll just share my screen in a second. Um, Right. So, hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Annis, and I'm counsel at Gordon Lanier Gervais in Canada, and also vice chair of Energy Storage Canada. And I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague Ben Hardwick Brown, and I'm going to go over, kind of quickly the kind of Canadian landscape from a policy and kind of legal perspective as quickly as I can. And then Ben will go over some of the details of the ITCs, which I think is, very timely and important and in development. So so we'll try to be as quick as possible. Just because there's not a lot of time. So very quickly about Gordon Lanier Gervais, we're Canada's biggest law firm. We're actually celebrating 200 years. So we're actually older than Canada this year. But we've got offices across the country. We're fully bilingual, and we're a full service law firm in the sense that we service all aspects of Canadian commerce and international. And we do have an energy group that is across the nationwide, of which I'm a part of. And we've got some of our, some of the biggest clients in storage. We deal in energy and power. We combine that expertise with climate change, carbon markets, carbon finance. And then we obviously have a huge, especially in Ontario, because Ontario was one of the first provinces in Canada to do a feed-in tariff program similar to what's in Europe. So there's a lot of experience here in Ontario with renewable energy and storage, because we also have one of the biggest standalone storage projects in the country, and I think actually North America. I also sit on the board of Energy Storage Canada. Energy Storage Canada is the industry organization for energy storage in Canada, and we're kind of we're agnostic as to the technology type. We really do advocate and lobby for policy changes with government and government authorities around advancing energy storage of all types. And so that would be mid duration, long duration, battery energy storage, of course. ESC was front and center in dealing with the Ontario government's kind of push towards the energy storage procurement that you'll hear more about, that is ongoing and really vital to the sector. But we're also very active in all provinces, especially Alberta and Nova Scotia, where there's a lot of activity happening. And we've got some of the biggest names on our leadership council, which is kind of it's the leadership council really decides the policy of ESC, but we're very active. We meet once every 2 weeks and really push policy and energy storage. And so, if you're looking to understand what's happening in Canada around energy storage, I would encourage you to join or attend our conference in October, which is happening in Toronto this year. And so I'll speak a little bit as a lawyer, but also as vice chair of Energy Storage Canada. And what we're really seeing is, Energy Storage Canada has been around for, I would say, at least kind of maybe 8 years, but we're really seeing in the past 4 years the pickup around energy storage, and we're seeing governments taking a very kind of hard look at the role that energy storage can play. And part of that is really also, there's a kind of policy context for it. A lot of it is being driven by the energy transition and the need to decarbonize. There are kind of federal targets. Canada is part of the Paris Agreement, but then there's also targets at a provincial level. And the way that our country is organized is that we're a federal system, and the provinces have their kind of role, and the provinces are actually responsible for energy to the extent that the energy systems are cross provincial or international borders. It becomes the federal jurisdiction, but Canada, for instance, Canada has kind of under our constitution has broad authority to implement things like a carbon tax. And we will the federal government will be putting forward a clean electricity regulation. We expect it to come out, I think, later this summer or in the fall, and that will also help really drive some of the policy that's happening at the provincial level in terms of electrification and really cleaning that electricity to decarbonize it, because it's one of the goals that the federal government has in terms of meeting their Paris Agreement requirements or goals. So in Ontario, Naeem has talked to you a little bit about it. There's a lot of things that are driving storage in Ontario. It's going to be very busy in Ontario for the next couple of years. The federal government, or sorry, the provincial government is really driving the IESO, which you'll hear from later today, to decarbonize, but also to build up the system at the same time to accommodate not only like further electrification, but growth in Ontario generally. Ontario is Canada's biggest province and most populous province, rather, and we're home to the GTA, which is 13 million people, which is almost a third of Canada's population. So, quite a populous province, relatively speaking. So the Ontario government released the Pathways to Decarbonization report in December of 2022, and that was kind of instrumental in laying the framework going forward and really kind of set the stage for the expedited long-term RFP. And the results were announced in May. I'll let Nick talk to that, and then, I think the important thing is that the Ontario government is doing something that's very smart in the sense that they've got the expedited long-term RFP that happened. They've announced the long-term RFP, which is the LT1, and then in the most recent kind of report that they put out actually on July 10th, which is called Powering Ontario's Growth, they've instructed the IESO to proceed with the LT2. So it's a kind of a pathway to successive procurements, anticipating a huge amount of growth over the next few years and especially a decade as we seek to kind of electrify pretty much everything. So that's kind of the policy. I think the other things too that is really driving policy in Ontario is we've got so we did have in Ontario the largest battery bilateral kind of negotiations with the IESO on the Oneida battery storage project, which is a 250 megawatt BESS that is providing, various kind of grid services, capacity, frequency regulation, energy, and operating reserve services. So BLG actually acted for the proponent on that project. It was really interesting. The contract is available online. It's there's obviously a lot of the commercially sensitive information has been kind of like blacked out, but the contracts kind of follow a certain format with the IESO, and this one was a little bit different, but it's not that different from ELT1. And I should mention that the contracts under ELT1 and LT1 are contracts for capacity as opposed to energy at this point. I would say the other thing that we're seeing really driving growth in energy storage in Ontario is the concept of corporate PPAs. So we've recently, for example, we've got the Stellantis battery project, and then Volkswagen has also announced a partnership with the Ontario government and the federal government to build their battery manufacturing plant. But when industry comes to Ontario, they're looking to really kind of do it in a way that's green and clean. Ontario's electricity system is relatively clean in the sense that I think 90% of our 10% of our electricity is, during peak is really produced by natural gas generation. But for the most part, we are a province that is run on nuclear, which is, relatively kind of low emissions. And then we've got our historical kind of hydro facilities, which also play a big role. So, but as we're seeing, big industry come in, it's we've already got industry here, but some of the newer kind of industry that's coming in terms of the battery EV battery manufacturing. We've also got data centers, which are obviously big kind of energy users, and those companies are looking for, clean energy because they've got their own targets. And so within that, they're really pushing the renewables, and to get firm power storage is obviously part of that. And I think what you'll see in Ontario's Powering Ontario's growth plan is that they've announced the LT2. And so that's designing future competitive procurements to acquire new clean electricity resources, including wind, solar, hydroelectric storage, and bioenergy. So we are going to see kind of like a push to that, and really how storage is going to interact with all aspects of generation on the grid is going to be very interesting. The other thing that I would say is probably not talked about as much, but is the concept of distributed energy resources. And so the utilities in Ontario and to some extent in Alberta are pushing that. And so I think there's a very big play there in terms of energy storage, and most of it will be batteries, to kind of move energy from kind of like our trunk systems to a more distributed grid. And we're seeing a lot of that happening with Toronto Hydro, for instance, which is our local utility, and storage has a really big role to play in that. So in Nova Scotia, it's another interesting province. They've recently enacted Bill 264, and that was really kind of like their foray into energy storage in a major way. Nova Scotia is also doing renewable energy procurements, and then at some point, offshore wind will probably play a role as well, because we're seeing that kind of advance, although storage doesn't really have a huge role to play in that at the moment. But Bill 264 enables contracts and future procurements, and a third-party procurement administrator will be announced, and there will be consultations with stakeholders and proponents on services and how services are priced for energy services, storage services. And then I think they're looking at assessing the fees, studies, and procedures related to interconnection requests. And so that's also something that is happening in Nova Scotia. They've got something called the Green Choice Program, which is being administered by COHO, and it will procure up to 350 megawatts of wind. And we do expect to see storage playing a role there as well. So then as Naeem also talked about Alberta. So Alberta is interesting. It's probably the busiest province right now in terms of renewable energy. They've got an energy-only market, and it's really one of the places where merchant facilities can operate. It's difficult to operate a merchant facility in Ontario because of the global adjustment that he mentioned. But in Alberta, you don't have that, so it is a little bit easier out there to build merchant facilities. So, as Naeem talked about, there's the equitable tariff, and storage is treated only as load right now, and it's required to pay the rate DTS, the demand transmission service, of 150 megawatt hours for energy consumed per hour for energy consumed, while generation does not pay any tariff. So load is basically covering like the entire costs. However, due to the decarbonization of the grid and the new renewable energy that's going onto the grid, storage is also providing a really valuable service in Alberta. And so ESC is working. We're part of the kind of the consultations that are going on right now out there with the AESO, and we're working to reduce the tariff by up to 90%. We actually think that will happen. And then also happening in Alberta, there's Bill 22, and that allows TFOs and DFOs, so your transmission operators and your distribution system operators, to own storage to operate as a non-wires alternative. And that we have those rules in place in order to ensure competitiveness. But I think they're realizing that as a non-wires alternative, storage definitely makes sense. So they, as regulated assets, we're hoping to kind of lift some of those restrictions. And so now I'm going to let Ben get into the nitty-gritty details of the investment tax credit scheme that's in Canada, or contemplated at least.
Thanks, Kristen. Hello all. Again, my name is Ben. I'm a senior associate at BLG in Vancouver within the tax group. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the clean energy incentive tax credits. Next slide, please. So to incentivize taxpayers to invest in clean energy projects, Canada has introduced 5 specific tax credits. So the carbon capture, utilization and storage credit, which we'll be discussing in detail today, the clean hydrogen production credit, clean electricity investment credit, which applies to non-taxable entities, the clean technology credit, which generally deals with renewable energy projects and energy storage, and the clean manufacturing credit, which generally deals with the production of equipment used in the clean in a clean tech project. So next slide. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be focusing on the CCUS credit. So this is because it is currently the only clean investment credit with draft legislation, and it should be seen as a pilot, which will drive the framework for the other credits. So the idea here is if you're looking to take advantage of any of the credits, so for example, the hydrogen production credit or the clean tech credit, you'll want to pay attention to the drafting of the CCUS credit. As I move through the presentation, we'll make some comparisons to the hydrogen production credit and the clean tech credit and how we expect the legislation for these credits to be drafted. Next slide. So generally, there are 3 main features or conditions that need to be met to qualify for the CCUS credit, which can be broken down into smaller pieces. So with respect to the CCUS credit, these pieces include having an eligible use, meeting the conditions of a qualified CCUS expenditure, and meeting the conditions of a qualified CCUS project. So we're going to walk through each of these elements one by one. So the first question to ask in relation to all the clean energy incentive tax credits is what type of project are we dealing with? So to qualify as an eligible use for purposes of the CCUS credit, the project must store carbon either by dedicated geological storage or through the carbonization of concrete. So any other use is a non-eligible use, and they've specifically excluded using captured carbon for enhanced oil recovery. So the eligible use conditions in respect to the CCUS credit are similar to what we expect to see in respect of hydrogen production. So hydrogen production currently requires that hydrogen is either produced through electrolysis or blue hydrogen production, so where carbon is captured and stored. So next slide. So now that you've identified that the project stores carbon in a manner that qualifies for an eligible use, the next question is, what specific piece of equipment are we looking to get a credit for? So in respect of the CCUS credit, the equipment is broken down into 4 categories: capture equipment, transportation, storage, and use equipment, which is defined to mean the production of carbonized concrete at a rate of 60% mineralization. So more detailed definitions of each of these types of equipment are found in the definitions of Class 57 and Class 58 depreciation schedule. And these definitions are quite broad. So turning our attention to the clean tech credit, although they haven't drafted the legislation, the 2022 fall economic statement provided that the intention is to utilize paragraphs of the Class 43.1 depreciation schedule. So this seems somewhat intuitive, as Class 43.1 was enacted to provide accelerated depreciation in respect to the cost of clean manufacturing equipment. So in respect of hydrogen production, there's no specific depreciation class yet, but I imagine one will be drafted in the next few months, and equipment that will qualify for the hydrogen credit will be listed in this depreciation schedule. So the next question to ask is, do we meet the definition of a qualified CCUS project? So there are currently 5 conditions, and I know I've got a lot of words on this slide, but we can get through it pretty quickly. Firstly, the project needs to capture carbon in Canada. It can't be captured in a different country and shipped to Canada. I think the most important condition and the main focus should be on the project plan and what we'll need to provide to the Minister of Natural Resources to receive the issuance of the initial project evaluation. Now, they haven't explained to us exactly what that's going to entail, but I think that'll be the biggest hurdle. The third condition requires that the eligible use of the project is at least 10%, and we'll talk about how that applies in a few slides. And then the fourth and fifth condition are pretty straightforward. You need to comply with all regulation, and the project cannot involve the capture of carbon from coal-fired generation. So there are two additional conditions that we expect to see added in the draft legislation. One is that large projects will be required to contribute to public knowledge sharing. And two is that certain labor requirements are met. So the labor requirement conditions appear in all of the clean energy incentive credits and generally include simply fair market wages for employees and 10% apprenticeship. So the idea here is Canada wants to grow the labor force in these industries, and this is a way to kind of force the hand. So the following specified rates apply to the various CCUS equipment described above. So as you can see, 60% for ambient air capture, which is the highest rate for all of the credits, 50% for any other form of capture, and then 37.5% for transportation, storage, and use equipment. So earlier I spoke of the eligible use ratio that is applicable to both CCUS capture and transportation equipment. So the eligible use ratio is generally your eligible use of property divided by its total use, and it effectively lowers the overall credit based on the amount of ineligible use property. So based on the drafting, the eligible use ratio does not apply for storage or use equipment, which makes sense as these types of equipment can exclusively be used for eligible uses. So this is compared to something like a pipeline, which could be used to transport carbon for an eligible use like permanent storage or an ineligible use like enhanced oil recovery. The hydrogen production credit functions somewhat in a similar way. The credit received is reduced as carbon intensity of the project increases. So just kind of turning our attention to the hydrogen production credit for a second. Basically, we expect the hydrogen credit to function in the exact same manner as the CCUS credit. There will be an eligible use requirement, which will be electrolysis or blue hydrogen production. It will need to be a qualified hydrogen expenditure, which we expect will be defined in a new depreciation schedule. And then finally, the carbon intensity of the project will determine if equipment qualifies for the full or a partial credit. So moving on. So we wanted to provide you a somewhat simplified example of how the CCUS credit is computed. This example would be in relation to carbon transportation expense of $1,000 in a qualified CCUS project. So the predicted eligible use ratio is determined in 5-year increments for the 20-year life of the project. So for example, in years 1 through 5, we expect to see 60% eligible use. And then that specific amount is multiplied by a quarter of the project. So the eligible use ratio is then summed for each of the 5-year increments and then multiplied by the expenditure. So we take the 1,000 multiplied by our 75% eligible use, which gets us to $750, and then that amount is multiplied by the credit of 37.5%. So that's how we get to this 281.25. So just a few other things we wanted to mention is that currently the draft legislation for the CCUS credit does not contain a recovery method, but we do expect a recovery method to be added over the next few months. So this would be based on your predicted eligible, this would be based on if your predicted eligible use fell compared to what your actual eligible use ratio becomes as the project progresses. So this is very similar to what we expect to see for the hydrogen production credit, where if your carbon intensity levels increase over that which was predicted, there'll be a clawback. And we'd also like to mention that we don't expect to see a recovery method when it comes to the clean tech credit. That should be a lot more straightforward. So lastly, the budget has provided a plan for CCUS refurbishment credit. We haven't seen this legislation yet, but having said that, I would expect to see a similar mechanism in respect of both clean hydrogen and the clean tech credit. So just turning our attention to the timelines. So pretty straightforward here. Finance is developing the draft proposals for the CCUS credit. The next to come is the clean tech credit. In the midterm, they're going to turn their attention to the clean hydrogen credit and then to clean manufacturing. And then, as we kind of expected, the clean electricity credit will be the last. And this kind of follows along the fact that it isn't expected to come into force until 2024. So just the last slide we have here is just on some main takeaways. So basically, the hydrogen production credit should be drafted in a very similar way to what we described today for the CCUS legislation. Like I said, there will be an eligible use, there'll be a list of property that it applies to, and then there'll be a reduction mechanism based on the carbon intensity. The clean tech legislation looks like it will be much simpler than the CCUS legislation. There may not be any eligible project requirements or a credit reduction mechanism. It just doesn't seem like the credit is built for a system to reduce in any way or require some specific type of project. It'll be solely based on if you fit within the 43.1 depreciable property. And then lastly, the real hurdle of acquiring any of these clean energy credits is going to involve putting together the project plan and acquiring the initial project evaluation from the minister. So we'd suggest keeping a firm eye on what this process entails in respect of the CCUS credit, as it will likely be duplicated for the hydrogen and the clean tech credit. Yeah, so that's it from my end.
Great, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Kristen. I would now like to take the opportunity to engage the discussion with Nick Topfer from the IESO. Perhaps I can start by letting Nick briefly present himself and his roles, and then we can have a discussion.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for having me here today to Clean Horizon. So my name is Nick Topfer. I'm currently working as an advisor on the design and delivery team in the resource acquisition group of the IESO. For anyone who's not familiar, we're the system operator in Ontario. So along with running the wholesale market, we're also responsible for long-term electricity planning as well as electricity resource procurement, which is the area that I've been working in for the last 2 years. So Naeem and Kristen already provided a little bit of context on the Ontario market, but just to give a high-level overview, for the last decade or so, Ontario's been in a strong supply situation where we haven't really needed to run any large competitive procurements. However, in the last couple of years, we've been seeing an emerging capacity need starting in the mid to late 2020s and moving into the 2030s, as well as an emerging energy need starting in the 2030s. And so these needs are driven by a number of factors, largely increasing demand due to electrification, uptake of EVs, electrification of transportation and heating, but also the upcoming retirement of one of our nuclear plants, the Pickering nuclear plant, scheduled refurbishments of several of our other nuclear units, and then just some of our natural gas fleet and our renewable fleets expiring, their contracts reaching the end of their term. So in order to meet these needs, the IESO's launched what we call the Resource Adequacy Framework in 2021. And this is a strategy that intends to unbundle the various electricity grid services that are required and to competitively procure these services with a three-pronged approach, looking at the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And so this framework is intended to align acquisitions and work in sort of an iterative, cadenced fashion that we can tailor to our needs as they evolve in the coming years, while balancing ratepayer and supplier risks and recognizing the unique characteristics of the different resource types. So the short-term aspect of the resource adequacy framework is covered by our twice annual capacity auctions, which offer one-year commitments and thus far have mostly been geared towards demand response. The medium term is covered by our cadenced medium term RFPs, the first of which was the MT1 RFP, which concluded last year. And these are aimed at recontracting existing assets for 5-year terms as they come off of contract. And then finally is the long-term RFPs, which is another cadence series of procurements that are geared towards new build resources with 20-year contract terms. And these are what I'm here to talk about today. So I think Naeem has some questions prepared that we can start the discussion with.
Yes, sure. So maybe one of the first questions that I have, given that Kristen just also mentioned the Powering Ontario's growth plan, is how much more capacity are you planning to procure in the future, especially under the upcoming LT1 and the LT2 procurements?
Right. So the first two procurements that we launched in terms of long-term procurements were the LT1 RFP and the ELT1 or expedited LT1 RFP. So the LT1 has a targeted in-service date of May 1st, 2028. But as we're seeing some capacity needs emerging sooner than that, as early as 2026. We started with the expedited LT1 RFP, which is like an accelerated version for developers who thought they could meet a more aggressive timeline and received some added financial incentives for doing so. So we just concluded the ELT1 RFP, and we announced the results of that last month, the end of last month. So through the ELT1 RFP, we've procured 882 megawatts of new storage. And the LT1 RFP is ongoing currently with a target of procuring an additional 1,600 megawatts of storage. The LT2 is the next in the cadenced series, and we're in the early design phases of that now. This is intended to capture any additional capacity need, as well as the emerging energy need that we're seeing in the start of the 2030s. So we haven't actually set targets for the LT2 yet, but we will be providing updates shortly, and we're intending to launch the LT2 in early 2024. The way this whole cadenced approach works is, so each year we publish what we call the annual planning outlook in our planning department, which looks at our current supply mix and also the 20-year demand forecast, and identifies areas where we see needs emerging in terms of capacity or energy or ancillary services, etc. And then this feeds into another annual report that we release called the Annual Acquisition Report, which specifies in a given year which electricity grid services we need to acquire and how much and in what time frame. And that sort of informs the targets that we set for the various procurement mechanisms.
Thank you for the insights. That's pretty interesting. And given that you talk about future procurements, do you have any specific plans when it
Sorry, Naeem, your audio is cutting out for me.
comes to creating hybrid kinds of procurements like what we've seen in the past in California, where things all exercise the only procurements?
Sorry, Naeem, your audio cut out. I think I missed about
Sorry,
half
maybe
of that
I'm
question.
having some internet issues.
Would you mind repeating
can
the
you
question?
hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Yeah, so I was wondering about the future of these procurements and their nature. Would they still be happening in the same format where you're just procuring capacity, or would be more looking to more of a hybrid exercise where only a part of the capacity will be procured through procurements and the rest would be more based on merchant opportunities?
I see. Okay, so yeah, we're one of the main focuses of the resource adequacy framework is to unbundle services and target contracting only the services that we need, while allowing contract holders to participate in any other markets as they see fit. So currently, with the ELT1 and the LT1, we are contracting only for capacity, And as long as the contract holders are fulfilling their contractual obligations, they're free to participate and earn extra revenue in the energy market, the ancillary service market, as well as the newly forming clean energy credit market. So we intend to proceed with that approach in the future. The nature of the contracts may change from iteration to iteration of the LT procurements based on the needs that we're seeing, which are identified in the annual acquisition report. So for example, like I said, for the LT2, we're anticipating targeting both a capacity and an energy need. So the nature of the contracting will likely change in that aspect.
That's clear. That's clear. Thank you. Thank you. I got one of the questions from the participants regarding the tenders webpage for the developers to look at.
Pardon me, which webpage?
So one of the attendees is wondering if there's a specific webpage for the developers that they can look at to get more details.
Yes, so you can look at the IESO website specifically in the long-term procurement section. I can provide a link to Clean Horizon you can share with the participants. But there we have all of the contract documents posted, the RFP, the contract for the ELT1, the LT1, as well as plans for the future.
Perfect. I have one final question regarding the remuneration levels. So how are they exactly calculated? So we are seeing some weighted average prices on your official documents. Do you set any specific baselines for these prices or not? And do you expect them to decrease with time?
The weighted average price, are you referring to what we posted with the results of the ELT1?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So that was that. Yeah, that reflected the weighted average proposal price that we saw. So basically, the way that the remuneration structure works for these contracts, and it may change from procurement to procurement, but for the ELT1 and the LT1, where we're contracting specifically for capacity, as a result, we use just simple capacity contracts for these. So proponents bid in their contract capacity as well as a proposal price in dollars per megawatt business day, and then if they're successful and they're awarded a contract, they will earn just a straight fixed capacity payment that's the product of their contract capacity and their proposal price. And then as long as they're meeting their contractual obligations, they will just earn that fixed amount and be free to participate in other markets as well. I believe we will be posting individual prices for the successful proponents from the ELT1, but for now we only posted that weighted average just to give a sense of where roughly these proposal prices came in.
I see. Thank you. So I think that's most of the questions that I had, and some of the attendees have also sent our way regarding this specific topic. Would you like to add anything more on that note?
No, I think we could just open it up to questions, I guess.
Yes, sure. So thank you for sending out some of the questions right now, and maybe I'll start with the first, which is also about the Ontario procurements. One of the questions is mentioning an announcement of procuring 4,000 megawatts by IESO, and this person was wondering whether these 4 gigawatts include the ELT and LT1 procurements.
Yes. So that 4,000 is the overall target for all of the procurements that we're running up to 2027, I believe. So that includes the ELT1, the LT1, and also the same technology upgrades endeavor that we've been running, where we are basically accepting bilateral negotiations from existing contract holders who want to expand their capacity.
Great. Maybe now I have another question, which is about the opportunities for co-located and standalone energy storage systems. So this question is more oriented in the sense of which is more profitable. Is it better to co-locate it or just keep it in a standalone format in Canada in general?
Well, I would say it's kind of hard to say at this point as we don't have much in terms of data to draw from. We only have a couple of small standalone storage facilities in operation right now, and we don't have any currently operating that are co-located with intermittent generation. So I would say that
And I would say that market design has a lot to do with that. And so our markets are not as advanced as some of the markets in, say, California. So, you know, I think we'll get more information on that, but I know that the IESO has been looking at that in some of their, in particular in kind of the hybrid resources that they're looking at. So they're also developing kind of a policy and around hybrid resources, and that's underway. But I think market design has a lot to do with that.
Certainly. I think it should remain a case-by-case opportunity that needs to be investigated based on the specific project and specific geography. Just to keep in line with time, I have one final question regarding the FFR service, and I was wondering if Kirsten, you have an insight about this service, especially in Alberta, and any of AESO's intentions of making it an official service or creating any further procurements about it.
I actually don't. I don't practice in Alberta, so I'm not as familiar with that kind of that jurisdiction. But you know, we could definitely get back to whoever's asking the question with a response. I think we lost name. We may have lost our host.
Hello, I'm sorry, I am having some internet issues. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we cannot.
Yeah.
Hello? Yes. Yeah, sorry, I'm having some internet issues. Yes, so yeah, I think that's one of the points that they're still not that clear as of now. So we just got the results for the FFR procurement as of now, and that's something that still needs to be cleared up with time from the ESO's position. So I think that's. I have maybe one final question regarding the best way of new storage solutions to engage with the IESO on the road to final commercialization. So that's a question for Nick, actually. So it's more of how the synergy should be created between the energy storage developers and the IESO.
In terms of engagement, so we have been running pretty much monthly engagement stakeholder sessions that we encourage anyone interested to attend. We're taking feedback after all of these on everything we present, and then making adjustments to our design accordingly. I would also recommend anyone interested in visiting our website and signing up for our mailing list, where we're regularly sending out emails, keeping everybody up to date on updates as they come.
Yeah. And I would echo that. We act for obviously a lot of energy clients, and so the IESO is actually really good about putting out documents, taking comments, and we'll kind of dig into them in a way that's quite material. So, you know, we've had the draft kind of ELT contract was out for review and comment. Energy Storage Canada made comments on that contract. So did BLG on behalf of clients. So there is a pretty robust engagement service or process, I would say, and you can even catch up on some of the recorded webinars are actually on the IESO website, so you can get caught up if you weren't participating from the get-go.
Great. Would any of you like to add any points or clarify any other positions regarding his content? Perfect. So on that note, I would like to thank all of you, speakers and attendees as well. So we should be sending out the recording and the presentation slides as soon as possible. So on that note, I would like to thank you once again and wish you a nice day.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.